Hello everyone! This is the first in a series of lessons that were originally recorded in the summer of 2020. However, the original live streams ran pretty long, 3-4 hours on average. So I decided that for YouTube it would be more appropriate to cut them down into blocks of 1 hour and add a little introduction at the beginning and a little coda at the end. So this first lesson will focus on the basics of anatomy, going from the very basic construction of a character to certain more complex poses. We will explore, or at least begin to explore, different body types and how that affects the anatomy of the character. And finally, we will move on to different styles for drawing faces, covering both anime-inspired style and Western cartoons. If you want to support these lessons and these live streams, it's always helpful to subscribe to this channel. Check out my Patreon, patreon.com/ProfessorDrC, or check me out on DeviantArt and Twitter. I am Professor.Dr.C in both of those sites. Now, without further ado, class is in session, and today we're talking anatomy. Hello, and welcome to the very first official Professor Dr. C drawing tutorial. If I have not completely messed up the setup, even after the recording, it should be possible to see both the chat and my drawing board, and listen to my lovely voice while I draw. So I have had a poll on DeviantArt to ask what were the areas of drawing that people wanted to learn more about, and it wasn't even close. The clear winner was how to do good anatomy. And I understand that doing good anatomy is pretty much the basics for any kind of drawing, to the point that I would say if you realize midway through a drawing that you messed up the anatomy, it might be more time consuming to try and correct it than to just redraw it from the start. But let's start with something very, very simple. Again, if you have a piece of paper and a pencil, or if you have any drawing programs that you like, it would be fun if you were to just open it up right now and draw along, or at least try to do the same stuff I'm doing so you can see where the hang-ups are. So this is a fairly basic humanoid shape, right? It's barely a step up from a stick figure, but it already has something going for it. Namely, it has the joints, which are balls. It has the limbs, which are sticks. And it has the, head and torso, which are different shapes. Notice that the pelvis is made up of two really big joints. This might change depending on your style, but if you want to pose your character well, you do well to remember where these joints are. And in fact, if you want to be precise, there's another ball right here, a joint that pretty much is an approximation of the motion of the spine and the torso. Now, each individual vertebra can only move very little, but the totality of the vertebrae can move quite a lot. So you can have a character turn very far to the right or very far to the left. So it helps. It has a joint right here. I'm going to highlight them with different colors to make it even clearer. Notice that for now, hands and feet are just approximated as basic joints. We'll be dealing with fingers and toes later. But this is the basic thing. This is what you should do at the very outset of starting to draw a human figure. You determine where the joints are, and you connect the joints to create the limbs. Of course, the more complicated the pose is, the harder it becomes to precisely determine where everything goes. So this is just a simple standing human being. But let's try squatting. Not that complicated, but already moves around a lot of joints and a lot of limbs, which might even change depending on your perspective. So this is the same figure, but it's squatting. Here are the joints. Some of them end up being a bit hidden. But the principle stays the same, right? Now, of course, this sounds well and good in theory, but might not be so easy to do in practice, especially because you have a number of other factors to consider the moment you're creating your character. Number one to consider is the height. If you've seen any tutorial on the subject, you probably already know this. The height in a comic book style drawing is almost always measured in heads. So you take the length of your character's head from chin to the top, and you consider how many times do I need to repeat this same length to get to the height of my character. And this might seem a bit cumbersome or counterintuitive, but it is pretty much what defines one of the most basic aspects of your style. For example, we have this character, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 heads tall. That's pretty standard for an anime character. It would be exceptionally tall if we were talking, for example, about Western cartoons. If you look, for example, at The Loud House, the kid characters are give or take 3 heads tall. The adults are around 4, same as the older kids. And very rarely you see deviation from that. If you take something very extreme like South Park, the characters are a little over 2 heads tall. The head takes almost half the character size. As I said, in most manga you have 5 heads, going on 6 for very tall characters. Bayonetta, I think, has a record 8 heads tall, and she is freakishly tall. noticeably freakishly tall. But that's sort of the basics. When a character is standing, their height is measured in heads. When you want to have different characters and compare them to one another, you also use heads as a unit of measurements. So, for example, in a lot of shows, you're going to have adults who are 5 to 6 heads tall, and teenagers who are about 4 heads tall. Not very realistic, since most teenagers are just as tall as adults, but it does sort of convey the idea of the power dynamic. The adult has greater power over the teenager than the teen has over the adult. And this is something that a lot of shows convey just through these proportions. So once you have your proportions done, and you've decided how many heads tall your character is, you're going to want to start with the next step, which is more or less the proportion stage. Now, let's say that a character is 5 heads tall. We decided this much. So first we draw a head in whatever style fits our preferred drawing style. You can have your classic anime head, you can have your more American styled bean-shaped head. You can have whatever the fuck you want, essentially. But the head, anyway, remains the unit of measurements. Once we've decided this, we need to start adding the rest of the body. How do we do that? Well, we know that the character is going to have a torso, and they're going to have legs. Pretty obvious, right? What is less obvious, and it's a mistake that is very easy to do on digital art, not so much if you're drawing on pen and paper, but it is very easy to do as a mistake in digital art. The height of a character is mostly in the legs. So a tall character doesn't necessarily have a very long torso or a very big head. What they do is have very long legs. So if you just want two characters who are comparable, but one is notably taller than the other, generally what you want to do is have that character have very long legs. What I'm drawing right now is a very short character. But notice that the torso isn't particularly short. The torso is about 2 heads. The legs are also about 2 heads. Now, a tall character would probably have 2 heads worth of torso and 3 heads worth of legs. In this case, instead, we're shortening the legs so that we create a shorter character. And once you have the head, the torso, and the legs, the arms should pretty much come as a consequence. When they're in a normal resting position, so like this, the hands reach mid-thigh or upper thigh. Again, changes a lot. Shorter characters proportionally tend to have slightly longer arms compared to the leg. Taller character, not so much, but more or less you get this. And again, here we can identify where the joints are, which are the points where we can deform our character. Because of course, everything that isn't a joint wouldn't normally bend. These are the main joints. You have 6 in the legs, 2 in the pelvis, 2 in the knees, and 2 at the feet. You have 6 in the arms, shoulder, elbow, and wrist. You have the neck, and you have the center of the torso, the abdomen. These are the major ones. Once you have figured how to align these appropriately, most of the work of anatomy is done. So once you're done defining your character's height and you're done giving appropriate proportion to the limbs, we get to the joints themselves. Okay, so again, joints means the parts where your characters can move. And it should go without saying that the length of a particular limb, so of a particular stick in this circumstance, does not change when it's in a different position, right? So whether the arm is laying to the side or raised up, this part is the same length. This part is the same length, and the joint is simply bent. Same with legs. We want the squatting position we were doing before. Let's make sure that the legs remain the same length, and that simply we move along the joints. Of course, the degrees of freedom of each articulation are slightly different, and this comes just from understanding your own body. This is something you can do yourself with your own arms, your own legs. If you think that a certain wrist position doesn't quite work, try moving your hand until your wrist is in that position. Does it feel comfortable? Does it feel okay? If so, then keep drawing it. If it feels like you have to stretch it or you can't reach it at all, then you're probably doing something wrong. Unless, of course, the character is exceptionally flexible or has some other trait that would make them particularly flexible. So we can move on to the more difficult stuff. Of course, these are all very simple poses. Everything gets a lot more complex if you want something a bit more dynamic. So, for example, let's say this character is swinging a sword. Notice how I start from the arms, because those are the dynamic parts. Those are where the action takes place. So I'm going to start by drawing those, and everything else is going to be a reflection of that particular motion. So I draw the arms, I place the joints where they belong, I place the torso joint, which in this case will be a bit bent, because if we're thinking about swinging a heavy object. Okay, and Pablo asks, when you choose a pose, do you do it yourself or use one of those posing dolls? I am rather fond of Design Doll. It's a totally free program that you can use to have 3D dolls to pose and to manipulate. Sometimes I would use that, but most of the times I don't. Even those aren't very precise, and they are very, very time consuming. Now, if there is a pose that you are having serious trouble with, then by all means use Design Doll, have that, take those mannequins, pose them, and use that as a reference. That can totally help you. Better yet, find a photograph or take a photograph of yourself in that pose and use that as a reference. That can help you immensely, but it only helps if you do it with a grain of salt. If you just take the doll from Design Doll or a photograph, and there are libraries of references online, of course. If you just take that and copy it one-to-one, you might end up with something that clashes with your style. So, for example, remember how earlier I said that in most anime and manga, characters are between 4 and 5 heads tall, sometimes 6, and in Western cartoons they're usually shorter, 4 to 3 heads tall. Well, a human being is a lot taller than that, like 7 to 8 to 10 heads tall. So if you are using a photo as a reference, remember that the shape and size of the head will probably need to be changed when you're doing the final draft of your drawing. If you're using Design Doll or any other program like that, Poser or whatever, those do allow for a degree of modification. You can alter character's head size as well as the size of each individual limb. But I find that doing that is more time consuming than just figuring out the pose on your own. Although that's a personal preference, and I'm not in any way discounting the importance of dolls or figurines as drawing aids. If you find that it helps you and it doesn't make you lose too much time, that can be something helpful. So going back to what I was talking about before this digression, we have our character swinging the sword. As I said, we start by having the arms, because those are going to be the focus of the picture, and everything else needs to adapt itself to the position of the arms. We continue with drawing the torso. We have a bit of a torsion in the torso, because if you're swinging something, your spine isn't going to be perfectly straight. And we need to have a leg position that makes sense. So someone is doing something that requires a certain effort, something that requires a lot of balance, they're probably going to have the legs spread and slightly bent, because this gives you better balance and gives you better strength when you are lifting or moving something heavy. So in this case, where we have the joints, the hands are of course holding the item, the elbows follow the hands, the shoulders follow the elbow, the torso starts to become important, because now we have to consider exactly how far we will be twisting it, and then the legs follow the rest of the body in order to allow for this pose. Now, realistically, from the point of view of the character, it's probably going to be the opposite. The character is going to start by thinking, how do I position my feet? Then they're going to think of, how do I move my torso? And finally, they're going to have the correct position of their hands. If you've ever done martial arts, that's how they teach you, right? Feet first, have the right position, then think of your upper body. But when you're drawing, it helps to do it backwards. You start from the item in the hands, and then you work your way down to everything else in such a way that it makes sense. Now, Let's remain on this example and go a little bit more deeper with it. So far we've only seen just the very basics of the body anatomy, but what about the details? So in this case we said, okay, holding something in their hands. So there's going to be the fingers holding, attached to the wrist, with a thumb opposed. Then there's going to be an arm, with forearm first, arm later. And depending on how muscular this character is, this is going to change the shape of the arm, of course. If we want a muscular arm, we could do it something like this. You have a very thick central section, which narrows out at both ends, and there is a visible shoulder muscle, right? Then we want to have the abdominal muscles, which are pretty clearly defined here, and are also where breasts are attached. So notice that if this character does indeed have breasts, this is where they belong. They're attached to the lower parts of the abdominal muscles, which means one, a character with very impressive abs is probably going to have very pushed up breasts. But also, and this is a mistake I see very, very often, don't make the breasts, don't put them too high up. They're attached to the bottom of the abdominal muscle. So there is a buffer zone between the neck and start of the breast that you need to consider. Of course, then there's the abdominal muscles. It helps to draw a line, which is sort of the center, and then work around that. Now, the abdominal muscle may be very well defined. You know, you have a character with a six-pack or something, or they may be less defined, but just if they're less defined, what is most noticeable will probably be the line in the middle and the line at the side. And then you complete here with the coast. You know, the ribs, which have their own set of muscles. And then you get down to the hips. Hips are obviously what tends to differentiate male from female anatomy. Of course, there are plenty of exceptions, but if a character has wide hips, it's generally recognized as feminine. A character with narrow hips is typically recognized as male, masculine. Generally speaking, you can sort of, you can have, again, both a very muscular hip and thigh, where it's even noticeable the line between different muscles, or you can just have something less, a bit thinner, a bit less impressive. Whatever. This is also where genitalia belong, but we'll be talking about that at a later date. So far, let's have a modesty loincloth for this character. Knees. Knees are interesting because you can do them a lot of different ways. Certain drawing styles ignore them completely. You just have the leg, bend, but without any noticeable marking. And some style make it a bit more noticeable. notice that if the character is particularly fat or particularly muscular, then the knee is totally visible. There's no way around it. Unless you're going for a very, very stylized sort of depiction. And of course, then you get to the foot, and here, feet are kind of an equalizer. Everyone's feet sort of look the same. If you're not going for particular complexity, and especially if your character is wearing shoes, don't bother drawing toes. Just have the foot with the joint that connects it to the leg, and then a block of toes. You know, if the character is wearing regular shoes, there's not going to be any more flexibility than this. And even if they're wearing like sandals, it's unlikely that every individual toe is going to get that much attention, or if they're barefoot, maybe. So here we have a character that has pretty much everything but the face, including a sword, of course. And who may or may not have breasts, but if they do have breasts, they belong down here, not up here. Okay. Now, we've had a very superficial discussion of musculature. Let's get a bit more in depth. Let's take a regular character's torso, and I'm going to try to keep it androgynous, but you know me, I tend to draw girls more so than boys, so it may end up being a bit feminine. Then again, I tend to draw very masculine looking girls, very butch looking girls. So who the hell knows? Okay, musculature. When we're talking about the neck, we have a bunch of important things to consider. This is where I should tell you the exact correct name for these muscles, but I don't fucking remember. But if you have a character that has visible musculature, you're going to want to show it behind the neck, you're going to want to show it in front of the neck, and you're going to want to show the shoulder blades being very visible. Then we move on to the shoulder. Shoulders are the muscular character is going to have very thick padded shoulders that evolve into thick arms. And as always, the shape of a muscle is this, right? It gets wider in the middle, narrow at the end. This is true of every voluntary muscle in the human body. Virtually every. Skeletal muscles at least, fuck it. And if you follow this sort of general direction, you can get most of them done right. Now, under the shoulder blades, we have the chest with the pectoral muscles. The nipple belongs more or less around here. And again, if we're talking about female characters or any character that has noticeable breasts, breasts are made of fat, and the fat tends to accumulate here, lower half of the abdominal muscle. So don't make breasts attached to the collarbone, which is a mistake I see all the fucking time, and it drives me off the edge all the fucking time. Now, abdominal muscles. start out like this, get a bit broader around the midsection, and ultimately are connected to the pelvis. If you have a particular muscular character, you're going to see the V of the bottom of the abdominals connecting with the pelvis. And finally, you have the intercostals, the muscles connected to the ribs, which support the rib cage basically, and complete this sort of constructions. And then you can go straight down to the pelvis. This is more or less how you assemble the muscles on a character. Of course, most characters, unless they are bodybuilders or warriors or barbarians or whatever, aren't going to have this much visible muscle, but it still helps to know exactly where everything belongs. Especially because when we are thinking of a character who instead has noticeable fat deposits, it's going to follow more or less a similar pattern. Not exactly the same, but the breasts are still there. Even if they're bigger, they are attached to that part of the body, and unless there's something pushing them up, they're affected by gravity. Belly is going to follow sort of a similar shape. It's going to go down in the same way that the abdominal, following basically the abdominal muscles, since the deposit of ventral fat is located on top of the abdominal muscles. And in sufficiently fat characters, there's going to be fat upper pubic area, fupa, that falls in between the genitals and the belly proper. As for the arms, particularly fat arms that don't have a lot of defining musculature, probably don't have the same shape. There isn't a noticeable difference between the shoulder muscle and the arm muscle. It's all sort of covered in the same padding. And keep in mind that if the muscle has this shape, fat doesn't quite conform to it. If anything, it's more of a vague, roundish form. And then, of course, the neck isn't going to be as well defined. What's it called? Is probably going to be less visible. Neck bones in general are going to be less visible. But it still follows the same fundamental disposition, because that is the disposition of a human being. As an additional note, remember that breasts are affected by gravity. They're generally soft masses, not made of steel. And that the nipples, if the breast is not in any way being pushed up and if it's not artificial, is going to be on the lower part of a large breast, while on the upper part of a turkey breast. Actually, why don't we look at that a bit more closely in the next bit. So, if we're thinking turkey breasts, someone that is rather thin and typically young is going to have something like this. nipple points up at the top. If we're going to have somebody with large breasts, which droop a bit, it's probably going to be pointing a bit down. And if we're going for sort of the extremely saggy, then it's going to be all the way down, but this doesn't appeal to a lot of people, I would imagine. Although, of course, always keep in mind that the bigger the breasts are, the more they suffer the effects of gravity. So for smaller breasts, they will tend towards this shape, the perky one, and larger ones will tend more towards the heavy, downturned style. Everything all right so far? Okay, so imagine one of the stumbling blocks for a lot of aspiring artists is facial anatomy. And that's because there is no one answer to facial anatomy. There are a lot of different possible face shapes that are all legitimate and that can all work, but you need to do them well regardless if you want a semi-decent result. Now, if you've grown up with certain American cartoons, like say Fairly Odd Parents, Phineas and Ferb, that sort of style, you will remember some faces that were extremely deformed and were like either triangular shaped or rhomboids or whatever the hell went through the mind of the artist at that particular moment. I'm not a big expert on that sort of style. I mostly grew up with manga, so I will tend more to that style. I also grew up with a lot of Italian comics like Witch, for example, which is still rather close to a manga style. But all of those had in common, while being stylized, a certain degree of realism. There is a famous quote by Pablo Picasso that, I'm paraphrasing, I don't remember it exactly, but he said, I have no interest in the simplicity that comes before complexity, but I am very interested in the simplicity that exists beyond complexity. So in his study of cubism, he of course started out drawing very basic, very easily understandable figurative paintings, but as he progressed, he went on to create what were technically simple shapes, but were very dynamic and very expressive because they were the simplicity beyond the complexity. Now, do I want to compare Fairly Odd Parents to Picasso? I don't know, but my point is, learn to do basic face anatomy first, and then you can come talk to me about whatever other simplification you have in mind. So, how do you do facial anatomy? You will notice that I've drawn 3 basic face shapes. One is a fairly generic manga anime sort of thing. One is a fairly generic Western sort of things. Think Steven Universe, Star vs. the Forces of Evil, that sort of thing. And one which is sort of more a simplified comic book style. I'm thinking more Emmy the Robot as the direct inspiration, but there are a lot of comic books that use this sort of shape. Regardless, there is a fundamental aspect. The proportions change enormously depending on what style you're using. Typically, something that is common to cartoon art is big eyes, and you will find this in virtually every cartoon style drawing, to the point that drawings that have very small eyes usually are interpreted as being an attempt at greater realism, because you have to deliberately choose, I'm going to make my character's eyes smaller. You have to go against the common wisdom of the comic book and manga artists. The other thing you are going to wonder is the mouth size. And this was changing. This was changes depending on the style. Think Sailor Moon or Revolutionary Girl Utena or a lot of other anime. Mouths are very, very small compared to the eyes. Same with the nose. Very tiny noses, barely even there. On the other hand, think the opposite. Think Steven Universe. Giant mouths that take up most of the character's face. Think The Simpsons, where they have this overbite that is very characteristic, that is very noticeable. But again, you result with a face that a mouth that takes up a big portion of the face, and a face that itself has a strange connection to the neck, like a Simpsons face or a Futurama or something like that, or even Bob's Burgers, which is kind of inspired by that. It's going to be like this. You don't exactly have a neckline, you just have a big mouth, a big neck, with no loss of continuity. So let's start, and of course then you have to ask nose and ears. Some styles omit this completely, some styles don't. Some styles go crazy with it. If you've ever watched Full Metal Alchemist, remember the noses in that? You have like the mouth like this, and this weird, giant, long nose on most of the characters. They never understood what they were going for. And then, of course, hair, but that part is easy. Accessories, whatever. Again, to reconnect to what was asked before about using computer programs like Design Doll or anything else, this can help you for designing a face, or it can help you to just look at a reference. And you want to draw a character from a certain manga, just look up pictures from that manga and copy the style from that. Of course, different mangaka have different styles. You can't exactly compare Clamp to Kuta Hirano, but still, there are some principles that stay true. So, since I've bored you with enough theory for now, let's take the first face, and we do this. We take 2 lines, and we draw them around the face. This is going to be around more or less where the eyes and the ears belong. Notice where the flex point of the face is here. That should be more or less either in between or near the bottom of the area we select with these 2 lines. Then we got 3rd line that's up from the chin and arrives to the forehead. And now we've neatly divided our face into 6 helpful areas. Now, these lines become what we use as a guide for drawing the eyes. Notice that if your character is not looking directly at the audience, or they are there completely in profile, the eyes are going to be different. They are going to have a different shape. But if you've drawn these guidelines well, you don't even need to think how to deform them. The guidelines do the job for you. I wasn't thinking, oh, this eye should be smaller than the other, this eye should be bigger. I was just looking at the guidelines, following the guidelines. Bottom of the eye should be just above the bottom guidelines, top of the eye should be just below the top guideline, and the central one should define how much space each eye is getting. And there you have it, you have eyes. Ears, about the same height, of course, to the side of the face. Nose, of course, belongs on top of the central guidelines. But depending on what style you're going for, it might, there are a lot of ways, especially in manga, to do noses. Could be as simple as like Evangelion, where you have just one nostril on one side and a small triangle on the other. You could have something more complex, like for example in Helsing, where there's a whole nose drawn like this. Or you could be anywhere in between. For example, in Witch and Sky Doll, noses tend to be like this. Just the bottom is visible and the rest is kind of implied, or it only becomes visible once you do the shading. Because of course you're going to shade one part darker and one part lighter, and so it's going to become immediately obvious what the shape of the nose is. Then again, there are manga that just about ignore noses altogether. You're lucky to get like two tiny marks indicating the nostrils. Chobits, for example, does it all like this. Very, very tiny. None of this is necessarily incorrect. It just depends on what you're going for. Keep in mind that shonen and seinen series, so manga aimed at adults and young boys, usually tend to have more defined features, especially when it comes to nose and mouth, while help me out, what's the opposite of shonen? Whatever, manga aimed at girls tends to have less shoujo. A shoujo manga tends to have less defined features, so everything is a little bit daintier and a little bit less clearly defined. Now, mouth. If we're going for the traditional like Sailor Moon anime mouth, it can be as simple as this. Notice how tiny it is compared to the eye. If you look at yourself in the mirror, almost certainly your mouth is as wide, if not wider, than one of your eyes. Does not apply in manga. Mouth tends to be very small. You can even get away with not, if it's closed, not fully drawing it, and just have like the sides, and then a little bit of the middle, and this is a mouth. Utena does this in spades. A lot of the characters don't have a very clear mouth until they start speaking. And even after they start speaking, it's just this tiny triangle thing. Of course, all of this goes out the window once we move to a slightly more Western style of drawing. The basic principle applies. Let's do the guidelines. Let's do the eyes as defined by the guidelines. And now we have the question of what do we do? Let's put the ears, who cares? What do we do with nose and mouth? Again, nose can be a ton of different things. Can be something like this, It could be just a tiny vertical thing, like a tiny triangle. Could be a big triangle, like say in Family Guy. Can be a lot of things. What really changes from manga style to traditional Western cartoons is the mouth. In the West, apparently, we like big mouths, and the character isn't really that expressive until they have a gigantic mouth that can even deform the shape of their face. Think Gravity Falls, think Star vs. the Forces of Evil, but think even old stuff like, just Simpsons or Family Guy or anything like that. Still, the fundamental principles remain. If you have the guidelines well in place, you should be able to determine exactly where the nose goes, where the mouth goes. Keep in mind that in Western style, the nose generally is at the intersection between the vertical guideline and the bottom horizontal guideline. In manga, it's a bit lower, but these are details. Now, if we're going for something like this, where you don't have the luxury of a flex point through the face, you can do sort of the same style, but it might also be helpful to just abandon guidelines entirely and go with the flow a bit more, because with a face like this, it's harder to use as precise of a method as we might have in the past. Let's see, I did this in a second because when you have enough practice, you might not even need the guidelines, you kind of have them saved in your brain. But if you want to be precise and you want to do something, or you want to draw something you haven't drawn before, just draw the fucking guidelines. Down here we have this sort of Simpson thingy. As I said, if you look at Bob's Burgers, very much similar style. This also tends to have kind of bulging eyes. But this is a very specific style, and unless you're specifically trying to emulate that, you're not necessarily going to use it. Okay. Of course, once you're done defining the traits of the face, you want to add a hair. Hair is usually a pretty easy part. You just look it up, look up what hairstyle you want to draw, and you might as well be adding a wig on top of your character. It's very rare that the hair affects the anatomy so much. Sometimes, you might have a style where the hair covers one eye or something like that. But even then, you should draw it first and then cover it. Don't use this sort of shortcuts. It leads you down a lazy, ineffectual path. A lot of times, a criticism that is leveled towards certain manga is that the faces are all almost identical, but you only recognize the characters from the hair. If you are good at drawing different shaped eyes, it shouldn't be a problem, right? an eye like this is not the same as an eye like this, which isn't the same as an eye like this. All three could belong in the same anime without problem and give different characters different traits without having to invoke hair color, hair shape, or height, or anything else that's so explicit. Okay. And that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed today's lesson. I hope you will be using the tips and tricks I taught in your art. If you found them to be a bit too simplistic, or if there were subjects you knew already, don't worry, we will be getting into more complex and advanced subjects very, very soon. In fact, I plan to have much more content uploaded to this channel very soon. Lately, I have been focusing almost exclusively on my DeviantArt and Twitter, but I plan to start uploading much more to YouTube. So you will be seeing more lessons, more speed draws, some commentary content, and whatever else I feel like uploading here. But for now, class is dismissed, and goodbye everyone!